Have you ever been told that your voice is terrible? Or that maybe you have a voice for radio? Yeah, that kind of happened to me this week. That was painful. But I learned so many things. I want to be able to share them with you so you don't have to go through this same process either. And just so you know, I am actually using a new microphone, so you'll have to let me know whether you like the sound or not, because I want to see if it'll be better in terms of tone and sound in regards to doing more of these YouTube videos, because I hear it was pretty good. So, yeah. So to kind of start, I had a very interesting experience this past week where I wanted to meet up with another voice actor to get his take on how he does some of his voices. And it was quite interesting because we had been trying to schedule this for a while, but I had been in and out of the hospital. But finally, after a lot of scheduling conflicts and a lot of health fluctuations, we were finally able to get together, and I was able to pick his brain about how he did accents and how he did his villain voices. Now, I can't say that I'm any better at doing accents. They're just difficult to do, point blank. But what was interesting was the villain voices, because when he did villain voices, his villains sounded more like this. Now, I'm not doing it justice, because he can really sell a very good villain voice, but it was interesting because when I was doing my villain voice for the role that I'm in, he was saying that it sounded like absolute trash. Now, it's kind of interesting to get kind of feedback like that, where somebody says, "No, it sounds horrible. It sounds awful. What are you doing wrong? I don't get it. What is it that you're doing?" And you're kind of like, "Well, I don't know. I came to you for advice." you know, but it was interesting because as I'm going through this kind of conflicting emotions, I was thinking about it and I realized I was getting very irritated. And I couldn't figure out why in the moment, why I was getting so irritated. I came to him for help, I came to him for feedback, and he was just slamming my voice left and right. And he wasn't necessarily trying to do it in a mean way. He was trying to be a little nice about it, but there was a little bit of ego in there that kind of irritated me as well. But he was genuinely trying to help in his own form and fashion. And it was about maybe 5 or 10 minutes into this that I was thinking about ways to be able to just exit the conversation, just leave, because I was so done. But during a moment in there, I decided, well, you know what? I scheduled this for a reason. I've been trying to get this done for a long time. What is it that I was trying to get out of this? I'm like, well, I'm trying to get good information and I'm trying to get more voice acting experience. And this is part of the voice acting experience, right? And I told myself, well, feedback like this, sometimes I'm going to get meaner feedback. I need to just kind of stick it out. And I decided this and thought about this in the moment while he was, giving me critique on my voice, and I was like, you know what? I just need to kind of tough it out because this is what it's about, right? I need to go in, I need to get this feedback so I can become better. This was the whole reason for this. It was gonna be uncomfortable. I might as well just try to figure out whether or not it's going to, be as bad as it is. And I came to the determination in that moment that if I'm going to have a really, really bad experience with this, well, the best thing that I can take out of it is I can choose to leave whenever I want, but at the same time, if I'm in a meeting with a client or something like that and they happen to be meaner or they have worse feedback than he has or in the way that he's approaching it, then at least I'll have a really awful experience to be able to compare it to and say, well, at least it's not as bad as that, right? And that'll probably keep me grounded for future clients. And it was kind of interesting because the moment that I decided that, I was like, okay, I'm just going to roll with this. It was about maybe 30 seconds into that. I kind of calmed down. Everything was starting to go more smoothly. I was trying to find different mindsets and different perspectives to be able to approach it. Well, okay, let's say he's saying this. He's saying it for a reason. Why is he saying this? Why do I need to do this? And in the middle of all this thinking and changing my mindset, it got easier, it got better, and the voice director that I had been doing voices with the previous day uh, suddenly jumped into the chat, and he said, "Hey, what you guys doing here? I just wanted to see what was going on." We're like, "Oh, we're just kind of doing one-on-one practice." And he said, "Oh, would you mind if I listen to it? Because I kind of want to hear what it is that you guys have come up with." We're like, "Okay, yeah, sure." And it was cool because the moment that he popped in, it all came back to me as to, what we had done the day previous. He was doing voice directing one-on-one with me, and he told me that he loved my villain voice. He thought that it was perfect. And it was interesting because the voice that I do is kind of like this for the character, right? It's really kind of interesting. And he said that that was a perfect voice for the character. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me in that moment that, well, the reason why I was getting irritated before, subconsciously in my mind, my head was saying, well, no, you did a great job on this character. Now this guy is saying it's complete trash when another guy was saying it was perfect the day before. My brain didn't click those pieces until the moment when this voice director for the project came in and said, "No, you're doing it perfect." I was like, oh, he told me I was doing it perfect yesterday. So that means that I'm doing it good for the project, but this voice actor who I'm getting advice from doesn't think that I'm doing a villain voice good at all. And that was quite a paradigm shift. And so what wound up happening is when he came in, there was a huge dynamic shift. So I'll call voice director VD, and then the other voice actor, I'll call him V, because he's more classical or Victorian type of a villain. He does a lot more real world type stuff. And this is where things kind of really changed is the voice director started praising me and all the different practice that I was doing as I was giving out some of these practice lines. And V, the voice actor, couldn't figure out why he was praising me. He was starting to get irritated because now there's two conflicting instructors, telling me different things. And one could say there were too many chefs in the kitchen. But it was interesting because VD, because he has more experience being a voice director, he wound up explaining things in a really nice way. He wound up saying, well, just because your voice isn't good for V doesn't mean that it's not what was good for the project. He said, you auditioned, right? You auditioned with this voice? And I said, yeah. And the director picked you, right? I said, well, yeah. And he says, well, that's all that matters. They wanted that voice. It doesn't matter what any other voice actor thinks. We have all different interpretations of how a character should sound or what the interpretation is. You are perfect for that character. Don't be him. And I was like, oh. And it never occurred to me that that might have been a problem going into this practice with. And V, in that moment, also realized that, oh, well, you know what? He's got a point, because if the director wanted his voice, then I shouldn't be changing his voice to something that I think is better. It's good for the director, then that's what they want for the project. And so we both came to realizations in this. We're like, oh, wow, okay, well, maybe we don't need to be changing our voices. Maybe we should just stick more to the practice like it was supposed to be anyway. And somewhere along the lines, within the 5 to 10 minutes of doing practice voices and learning how to do different villains, we lost sight of that goal. So there's an importance in maintaining a goal when you're going in for a practice or when you're doing anything in voice acting. It's important to be able to make sure that you kind of stick to that path, right? Otherwise, you can kind of get lost in the weeds. Now, something that was more interesting was we kind of kept on going further into these voices, right? And it was interesting because at one point, when we were doing different voices for different lines and things like that, both of them at one point said that they didn't like the character voices that I was doing for some of these lines. And I thought that was kind of surprising because the voice director was lauding me on a bunch of different voices, but then for a couple of these, he said, "Yeah, I don't I don't like them. They don't sound believable." And I was like, "Huh, okay." And I said, "So what do I need to do to kind of change that?" And he said, "Well, first off, you're being a little over the top with some of these. You shouldn't be over the top." He says, "Why are you trying to be a different person other than you?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to get into the character and trying to convey what this character is feeling or what this character is doing." And he says, "Well, that's fine and all," he says, "but there's nobody that you can be other than you." He says, "It just goes right back to the audition thing. The reason why you're good for that voice is because you are you and you're approaching it from that perspective. Don't try to approach it from my perspective or another voice actor's perspective. Come at it from your perspective." And I said, "Okay." And so I did more of that, and they were saying, "Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds perfect. That sounds awesome." So, to kind of describe what I mean when I say that, they said at one point that I had a really good and really powerful voice. And this surprised me because when we did a practice read a week prior to that, I was trying to do a surfer voice, right? And I just wasn't very good at it. And the director wanted me for the role, though, because they need somebody to do this surfer bum, like radio guy, right? And as I did the voice, I tried to go up here and I tried to just be as intense as possible. And they said, "No, it doesn't sound very good." And I couldn't figure out why in the table read that me trying to nail the voice more didn't actually convey the character as well. And in this session that we did just a few days ago, they wound up saying, "Well, the reason for it, I think, is because you have such a powerful voice." And I said, "What?" I said, "I don't think I have a powerful voice." And both of them chimed in and they said, "No, you have a really powerful voice." And VC wound up saying, "You know what? I think the reason for this is very interesting." He says, I think it's because you are trying to be more like other people rather than yourself." And now I've said this 3 times, but I'm going to have to explain this. And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He said, "Actually, when you had to take off the other night when we did the table read," he said, "we were all talking about you, and we were all saying how great your voice was." I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Everybody was on the same page and said that your voice was excellent. It was great and very powerful, but none of us could understand why you couldn't get the surfer voice or make it sound more real." And I said, "Huh." I said, "That's interesting, kind of embarrassing." But he said, "Well, no," he says, "and that's kind of the thing." He says, "When you did it, though, I think I understand now, because now that we've gone through this and now that we've practiced, I am noticing that anytime we do a voice, you try to emulate us and you try to get to the level that we're at. So if I give you a line like, 'Can we just stop?' and I try to do it in my voice, you try to lean in towards more of what my voice is." And I said, "Well, I'm not trying to do that." I said, Basically, I just want to know what tone you're going for. And so I ask you, well, what tone are you looking for?" I'm like, "Can we just stop?" And I told him, "So when I do that, I'm just kind of looking for the tone that you want." And he said, "Yeah, but subconsciously, somewhere, you're trying to put my voice into it. So instead of going, 'Can we just stop?' you're going, 'Can we just stop?' And you're trying to emulate my voice almost perfectly, and it doesn't work because it needs to be your voice." And I took a moment and I thought about it. I was like, "Really? Am I doing that?" And the more that I thought about it to myself, I was like, "Holy cow." Actually, when I think that I'm trying to match the tone, I'm also actually trying to match the voice. I'm like, "Holy crap. Yeah, you're right." And he says, "And that's the problem." He says, "Is that your voice is so powerful and so crisp and so good that when you try to emulate us, who don't have as crisp or solid voices, you lose your quality in your voice. And I was like, really? I was like, I never thought about it like that. And he says, yeah, so now try doing it in your own voice. And I said, okay, can we stop? And he said, bingo, right there. That's exactly what I want. He says, you got the tone, but you did it in your voice. And that's what we are looking for when we're doing all these voice directing and things like that for the project. And all of a sudden, I then had an epiphany that, holy cow, I was doing things very, very, very different than what I was thinking that I was doing. It was quite interesting to be able to get this feedback because now I can actually look at characters very differently and I can improve a little bit more on the voice directing. I still need to work on the surfer bum, type of a voice, but at least now I'm doing it more in a voice that I would do, and it's my voice, right? It's not somebody else's. And in regards to that, it's quite interesting because one thing that they had been talking about when I was doing some of the voice lines, we had a practice line where the character was doing, what was the line? It was, bow before the world that I create. And it's supposed to be a villain voice, right? Maybe a little bit louder, but it was interesting because each one of us had a different way that we went about saying the line. Mr. V, he had a great, crisp villain voice. It sounded like some sort of old warlock that was, casting a spell or something like that. And then VD, he actually didn't really do a very good job on the line, in my opinion. It didn't sound like it belonged to a character. It kind of just sounded like he was reading it. And then when I went about it, it just sounded like it was campy, like it fell flat. Let me see if I can recreate it. It was something like, bow before the world that I create. Just really crappy. But the critique that I got from this was really, really interesting because they asked me, well, what is it that you're doing in here that sounds so different? Because your other voices sounded great, and then this one just sounds cheesy and campy. And I said, well, I don't know, and I did it a couple of more times, and it was interesting because V wound up saying, well, it sounds like you're just talking to a crowd of people. And I said, oh, you know what? Yeah, you're right. Come to find out that a couple of lines that we had practiced earlier was all about a villain announcing to the crowd that he was king or whatever, and we were still going off of kind of that sound. And I was like, oh, I forgot to adjust my sound to that. And I was like, dang it. And that's the thing about practice reads is you're going to be bouncing from one character to the next, and it's going to be different settings, different scenes, different contexts, completely different characters. And I forgot to adjust for that in the practice because I was still working on yelling and projecting. And it just didn't sell the atmosphere. And they said, well, try doing emotion with the action. And I said, well, the action actually it seems like to me like there's a bad guy in front of a crowd of heroes or people, and he's just telling them, okay, bow before the world that I create. And both of them were just kind of like silent for a little bit. And I told them, I'm like, did I say something wrong? And they said, no, actually, you got us thinking because we don't really know what the action is for this. And the voice director had a really, really good question. He leaned over to V and said, well, what action did you do when you were doing the line? Because it sounded really good when you were doing it. And he said, well, I pretended like I was casting a fireball. And he said, that's it. That's the action that you need to do for that character. So try casting a fireball when you do that. And then my line came out more like, "Bow before the world that I create." So now you can kind of see the difference in how effective the delivery was, how it changed. I could definitely practice a little bit more on that, but just off of the cuff, that's kind of what it was that I delivered. And it gives a different kind of a tone, a different kind of a feel, right? And it was something interesting that I was like, well, I know this as a voice actor. I'm always doing motions when I do things like that. But for whatever reason, I couldn't think of an action to do during that, and neither could the other voice actors. And it was interesting because V had to actually replay what it was he did in his motion, and that was what kind of lended to the delivery and sold it. And the advice they gave me next was something I didn't think about before. They told me no matter what you do as a voice actor, you always have to act in every single line. And I didn't think about that. I said, well, I just thought that, I just acted during the times that were really action-packed or, as I go through a line. They said, no, every single line, you have to think about what action it is that you're performing. Because even if you're going, right, you have to perform an action. Your head is tilting if you want to deliver it better. Like, because that is what your body and your biology is creating to be able to sell it realistically. How to be able to describe it. If somebody is just saying, in real life, right? You're going to get a very deadpan tone unless they're actually thinking, because if they're thinking, their head tilts, right? And then they go, and you can hear that in the trachea as it reverberates up and through the mouth at an angle, right? And you can hear that through the microphone. So even if it's just something as simple as that, you're having to act. And it doesn't matter what instance it is. And I never considered that when I was doing it. So in every moment, you are acting, you are playing out with your hands, with your arms, with your legs sometimes even, what it is that you are trying to convey, especially in pose. Your head tilts, the way that you move your head to the side, right? It all lends to the delivery. Somebody gave me a good example one time, the Doppler effect with the microphone. It's just the same tone, but I moved back and forth across the microphone to kind of lend that feel. If I want to deliver it a lot more believable, I go, ew, right? Ew. And then you can get that type of an effect. It's very similar in all of the actions that you do in voice acting. With every line, with every read, you have to think of an action and you want to be doing that in the scene. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to convey the emotion or what is going on as believably. So that was an interesting thing to learn. The next thing we covered was by far the biggest reason that I decided to do this practice was yelling. I am okay with yelling, but my voice gets raw and it just, I feel like I just didn't do believable yells. But it was kind of interesting during the practice because as we did yelling lines, both of them said that I did very well. And they said, I don't see anything that you need to change. And I said, really? I said, well, I'm putting a lot into it and I don't want to, make my voice raw. And they said, well, that's just going to come with it. There's really no way to be able to protect your voice much from doing that. And I said, well, I've been trying to get different techniques and stuff to be able to push air out, right? Rather than actually yell. And they said, well, that's fine. You can do that. That works for a lot of singing or if you're belting. And so it will keep the really, really powerful stuff from messing up your voice, where it'll at least give you a little bit more endurance or longevity in the session. They said, but other than that, that's not really going to do much in regards to protecting your voice. They were saying what you need to do is you need to practice projecting. And I said, yeah. And I feel like when I do projecting, it comes out horrible. And they said, okay, well, give us a line. And just for lack of a line, let's say I go, no. To me, that's projecting. And the voice director asked me, well, what is the percentage at which you're yelling? I said, well, that's probably about 70%. And he said, that's not projecting. He said, projecting should be more like 20%. I said, really? And he said, yeah. So give me a no. I said, okay. No. He said, okay, now do it like you're yelling. No. He said, okay, you're getting there. Now do it like you're mad or something like that. No. He said, that's projecting. I was like, really? I was like, that feels like I was only putting, like, in terms of a yell, maybe 30% behind it. And he said, yeah. He says, you're not supposed to be putting a whole lot of effort into it because in animes and things like that, they're going 100% sometimes with their yells. But if you're just projecting, he says, all you're doing is you're just taking your volume and you're raising it up a little bit. That's it. You're just raising it higher and then just kind of pushing with your chest to make it a little louder. But he said it shouldn't be something strenuous. It should be something comfortable. And I said, really? I never thought that projecting would be so much less than what I was putting into it. So now I can do more projections and I can do it louder, but I'm only still putting maybe about 40% of my actual yell. And I was like, holy cow, that really helps a ton. Because I thought projecting was much louder. It is not. So when you guys yell, make sure that you're going a little bit lower. You're just trying to increase the volume a bit, but you're not trying to strain your vocal cords.